Welcome back to All About Winning Daily Fantasy Sports. My name is Ty Patton. Unpredictable would be the best word to describe the wide receiver position from week to week in the 2019 NFL season. In week 13, I was able to have 4 of the top 5 scoring wide receivers in my player pool by focusing on the fantasy relevant numbers to the wide receiver position. In this video, I will share my research and help you identify the top wide receivers to target for your DFS lineups in week 14. Before I do this, before I break down week 14, I want to take a quick look back at week 13 and those fantasy relevant numbers. The top 5 projected wide receivers in week 13 were as follows: Cooper Kupp, Michael Evans, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, and Chris Godwin. The actual top 5 scoring wide receivers were Devontae Parker with 37.90 fantasy points, Robert Woods 33.20 fantasy points, Alshon Jeffrey 31.70 fantasy points, Devontae Adams with 24.40 fantasy points, and James Washington from Pittsburgh with 24.10 fantasy points. Now, these top 5 scoring wide receivers in week 13 averaged 30.26 fantasy points. They averaged 7.8 receptions on an average of 11.8 targets. This comes out to 2.56 fantasy points per target. They accounted for 6 touchdowns, and they averaged 107.2 receiving yards. 4 of the 5 teams won their games straight up of the top 5 wide receivers, and 4 of the 5 had quarterbacks that were in the top 5 as well. The only one that didn't was Washington, and his quarterback was Hodge. The other 4 wide receivers, their quarterbacks were also in the top 5. Now, I've developed this chart, and I want to go over it real quick for anybody who may be new to my channel. And I encourage you, if you have any opinions or comments about it, something you'd like to see me add, something you think I could do to make it better, by all means, post it below. I'll see what I can do. It's still a work in progress, but it just kind of gives you a guide. If you can screenshot it or pause the video or whatever and use it however you like, I'm going to show you how I use it, utilizing these numbers. But I want to go over it real quick, again, for anybody who may be new. The colors, green is obviously the best, and in the far left corner or far left side, those are the actual wide receivers that I'm targeting. Green is the best. Yellow's on the fence, which means I'm going to put them in the player pool. But when I do my lineup building, I'll be talking about ownership numbers and some other things. I'm kind of on the fence about that player. Now, red is obviously the worst, but it's in comparison to the rest of for whatever category that is. We all know Michael Thomas isn't a bad receiver. I got 8,300 in red, but that's because in this category, obviously you go down to Corey Davis, he's 3,900. That doesn't mean that Corey Davis is better, just means his salary is better in comparison to Thomas, because you go right over the targets per game, you see that Thomas is in green at 11.1 targets per game, which is the most on the main slate. So I'm going to go over these categories real quick because I had to abbreviate them. Obviously, I have the name, the team name, their salary. This category right here is targets per game. This is how many fantasy points per game they score. This is how many fantasy points per game their opponent allows to the wide receiver position. And this is their opponent's ranking in comparison to the rest of the NFL. This is their opponent. This is how many red zone targets they've had. This is their average depth of target. This is how many fantasy points per snap with all things relevant. Receptions, touchdowns, fumbles, yards, all those things factored in, points per snap. And this is the over-under for the game. So in week 14, these are the wide receivers that I will be targeting and why. And I do want to mention that I want to at least target one. I at least want to have one wide receiver or tight end with whatever quarterback that I'm using. The only quarterback that I'll use that I don't feel like I have to have a target is Lamar Jackson. But for the most part, if you've seen my quarterback video, I'm pretty sure I have at least one target to go with those quarterbacks. If not, when I do my lineup building video, I will have at least one target to go with those quarterbacks. So These are the quarterbacks the wide receivers that I'm going to be targeting in week 14, and the reasons why. Michael Thomas, 8,300. He's getting 11.1 targets per game, averaging 24.6 fantasy points per game. Very difficult matchup on paper. San Francisco has a DVP of 3 versus the wide receiver position. They're only giving him 27.2 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. Thomas has had 16 red zone targets. He has a low A dot, doesn't run many deep routes. And average depth of target, that's just target. That's not the receptions, that's all targets, whether he caught the ball or not. And points per snap is pretty high at 0.45. The over under on this game is kind of low. The points spread on this game is New Orleans as a 3-point home favorite with a game total of 44. On paper, this looks like a really bad matchup for Thomas, and is going to cause his ownership numbers to go down. Now, New Orleans did clinch their division last week, but they are still playing for home field advantage. San Francisco is very stingy versus the run, very difficult to pass the ball on. But I do believe that Michael Thomas is matchup proof, and he gets a ton of targets, and with that volume alone, I feel confident that he'll get his. He's 8,300, which he's been up to 9,900 a few weeks ago, so his price is down. It's still fairly high. It'd be hard to get Thomas and McCaffrey both in the same lineup, but I do want to have some exposure to Michael Thomas because I feel like he'll be contrarian because other people are going to be afraid of the matchup. And a long time ago, I heard a guy say, you go talent outdoes any matchup. So I believe in that, and I will have some exposure to him. Like I said, his ownership numbers, the projected ownership numbers that I've already seen, are really low because of the perceived matchup, and he can definitely break a slate. Breeze goes to him. There's a lot on the line for New Orleans. They're home, and I thought this total would be a little bit higher, but the San Francisco defense is they are legit. But I do feel that Michael Thomas is matchup proof. Next is Tyreek Hill. He's 8,100. He's getting 7.9 targets per game, 16.9 fantasy points per game, going against the number one defense versus the wide receiver in New England. And they are giving up 23.7 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. He's had 4 red zone targets, has a decent average depth of target of 14.2 yards, 0.398 fantasy points per snap, highest total on the board, 49. I do want exposure to this game. And last year he had 7 receptions, 142 yards, and 3 touchdowns in New England. That was on 12 targets. And he had 7 receptions, 133 yards, and 1 touchdown in 2017. This is, like I said, this is the highest game total on the main slate. And I want pieces to this game. His ownership is going to be low. Similar to Thomas because of the perceived matchup. But if New England is going to play man-to-man with Tyreek Hill, I can see him he's a great route runner. I can see him getting past them a few times. He did it last year. And Mahomes likes to go to him. I think this game will definitely have a lot of scoring. Game total is 49. New England's only a 3-point home favorite, so they think it's going to be a close, high-scoring game. And I think Tyreek, he can break a slate, and I will have some exposure to him. And he's priced up. You got to get 24 fantasy points, but I feel like that's doable. Obviously, 8 receptions, 100 yards, and a touchdown puts you there. So I will have some exposure to him. Next up is Devontae Adams, and I have him in yellow. He's 8,000. He's getting 10 targets per game, 18.2 fantasy points per game. Washington's number 16 DVP versus the wide receiver position. They give up 35.7 fantasy points per game. He's had 13 red zone targets, has an average depth of target of 10.4 yards, scoring .363 fantasy points per snap. The game total is really low, 42. I'm more worried about this game flow. They're 13-point home favorite. If this was a team that the point spread was lower and a team that I felt like could push Aaron Rodgers, I would like Devontae Adams a lot more. Now, to build that lead, obviously, you know, you could have Adams involved, but I don't feel like Washington's going to do much scoring at all. And if Green Bay gets out on them, they don't mind using Aaron Jones and Williams in the backfield and, change the whole game theory and go out that way. So I'm a little bit concerned with him. The volume is definitely there. This is Rodgers' favorite target, obviously. And I'm just real leery at 8,000. And truthfully, if I was at 8,000, I would probably figure out a way to get up to Tyreek Hill or Michael Thomas. So I'm going to probably limit my exposure to Adams this week just because I feel like there's a lot of different ways that Green Bay can win this game and not necessarily have to rely on the passing game too much. And, if they've got a lead or if you get a rushing touchdown and you follow that up with a defensive touchdown, Haskins turns the ball over, has been known to do that in his starts this year, and you get in short fields, and I think it just limits the opportunities for Adams, and that's why I have him in yellow. I'll probably have just a little bit of exposure to him, but not as much as the other. Like I said, at 8,000, I would probably figure out a way to get up to at least Tyreek Hill for 100 more. Next is Chris Godwin, 7,300. Indianapolis has a 19 DVP versus the wide receiver position. They're giving up 37 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's averaging 9.7 targets per game, 19.1 fantasy points per game. He's had 16 red zone targets. I'm on Evans here. But let me just go back to Godwin. And he's 7,300. He's getting 8.6 targets per game. He's scoring 21.5 fantasy points per game. Same thing, Indianapolis 19 DVP versus the wide receiver position. They're giving up 37 points per game to the wide receiver. He's had 12 red zone targets, 10.5 ADOT, 0.278 fantasy points per snap. Nice total in this game. The thing with Godwin is, the next wide receiver is picking out which one. Because, I'm just talk about Evans too at the same time. He's 7,200. He's getting 9.7 targets per game, scoring 19.1 fantasy points per game. Same numbers with Indianapolis, 19 DVP, 37 fantasy points per game. He's had 16 red zone targets. He has an ADOT of 15.2, 0.2 points per snap, and the game total. I like Winston, and I like one of these guys, and I feel like I have to play one lineup with Godwin and then play the exact same lineup with Evans. I want to have some exposure. Winston's throwing the ball over 40 times a game. These guys are getting it done. This is a good matchup with Indianapolis at number 19. I know Indy doesn't want to get into a shootout with them, but I feel like Tampa Bay at home. Tampa Bay is actually a 3-point home favorite, so they think it's going to be a close game. The game total is the second highest on the board, 47.5. It's now 47.5 points. So yeah, that's what I had over here. I will have exposure to one of these. It's hard to choose which one. And if one's going off, the other one might be getting some, but having them both, and especially having them both in there, it would cost you 14.5 to have them both in there, and you need to get over 45 points between the two of them. Um, there's been games where one of them's been up in the high 30s. I believe Godwin actually had one game that was 40, and Evans too. So it's just a matter of which one you like. Um, I don't see any different. I think Evans, as far as his matchup versus Indianapolis cornerback, is a little bit better than Godwin's, and I'll go over that with you when I do my lineup building. But for now, I'm just going to have exposure to both of them. It's been like 1 week it's Godwin, 1 week it's Evans, and back and forth. It's just pick the one you like and hope you get it right. Next up is Edelman from New England. He's 7,100. He's getting 10.3 targets per game, 18.3 fantasy points per game. Now, Kansas City has the DVP at number 2 versus the wide receiver position. That's because they get shredded on the ground. 26.7 fantasy points per game. That's what they give up. He's had 18 red zone targets, has an ADOT at 9.7. He doesn't run many deep routes, and he's scoring .269 fantasy points per snap. Highest total on the board. I want all kinds of exposure to this game. Highest total on the board. I like to target those games every week. That doesn't mean I don't target other games. Someone I think got confused not too long ago, because I look at all the games and I look at the matchups. But I really like this matchup. I like how this sets up. Edelman. This is on paper. It looks like a bad matchup, but I think they're going to come out throwing. They're coming in off a loss. They're at home. Last time they played in New England which was last year against Kansas City. It was a really high scoring game. He's averaging 19 fantasy points per game in the last 3 games he's had versus Kansas City. And as I said, it's the highest total on the main slate, and his volume, just 10 targets a game gets him there. So I will have some exposure to him and different pieces of this. I'm going to try to stack this game up in different ways, but a lot of these players are really expensive. Next up, DJ Moore. He's in yellow. I'm kind of on the fence with him, and the main reason I'm on the fence with him is because if I'm going to have the Carolina passing game, then I'm probably going to be fading Christian McCaffrey, and I'm really high on McCaffrey this week. I don't like correlating or putting the Kyle Allen, DJ Moore, Christian McCaffrey in my lineup. It could work out, and I have seen some of the lineups lately that have had quarterback, running back, wide receiver combinations, but I don't normally build that way. So now DJ Moore has a really good matchup this week. They are, see what do we got here? Atlanta has a 26 DVP versus the wide receiver position. They're giving up 39.6 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's getting 9.6 targets per game, averaging 17.3 fantasy points per game, 12 red zone targets, and 10.7 ADOT, scoring .338 fantasy points per snap, third highest total on the board at 47 points. It's just that Christian McCaffrey vulture factor that concerns me here. I don't feel like McCaffrey is about 53% of the offense, if not more. And I'm just really concerned if McCaffrey gets going and he's punching them in, there's not going to be much meat left on the bone. So I'll have some of more, but it'll be in lineups that I don't have Christian McCaffrey. Next up is Calvin Ridley, 6,700, getting 7.3 targets per game, 15.4 fantasy points per game. Carolina's given up 39.4 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, which is a DVP of 24. He's had 6 red zone targets, has an ADOT of 13.4, and points per snap is .276, third highest total on the board at 47 points. If Julio's back playing, which I believe he's expected to be back, this opens up a lot of things for Ridley. the matchup for Julio will be much more difficult, and Austin Hooper is supposed to be back as well, so he doesn't carry any injury designation this week. So Matt Ryan will have his full array of weapons, and it's just, you know, he's obviously cheaper than Julio Jones, $800 cheaper, and Julio has versus Bradbury has a much more difficult matchup. I'll have some exposure to Ridley. I do like stacking this game. There's lots of different ways of doing it, and he's definitely a viable piece that you can use. And not super crazy about the price with what his fantasy point average is. So at that price, you need to get about 20 fantasy points. So, but I feel like this game has the potential to have some some higher fantasy scoring among the wide receivers and also Christian McCaffrey. So I will have some exposure to Ridley. I probably prefer him over Julio this week, and so I'll be trying to get him in my lineups where I can, especially with my Atlanta, Carolina stacks. Next up is Odell Beckham. He's 6,300. I haven't used Odell. I don't know that I've used him at all this year. He's 6,300. He is less than Jarvis Landry at 6,500. And Landry's obviously getting more targets per game. Odell's averaging 13 fantasy points per game, which is less than Landry. Cincinnati's number 10 DVP versus wide receiver position, and they're giving up 32.8 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's had 7 red zone targets, has an average depth of target 12.3 yards, only scoring .173 fantasy points per snap. Lowest total on the board. This is very risky, probably contrarian, sneaky, but the matchup versus BW Webb is very good for Odell Beckham. Webb is giving up a quarterback rating of 120.6. So this could be sneaky. This could be a nice pivot off of a more popular Nick Chubb. A lot of people like Chubb in a lower scoring defensive battle, but I'm going to have some exposure to Beckham at 6,300. It's to the he does get targeted a lot, and he can bust the slate. He hasn't had a real big ceiling game, but he can do it. And this is a really good matchup, and I think he's going under the radar this week. So I'm probably going to have more exposure to him than what the ownership numbers come in at. But I have a lot of interest in him at 6,300. Next up is, and I'll be coming back to Boyd. He was the one that I added. Emmanuel Sanders for San Francisco. He's 5,800. Another receiver with low ownership. New Orleans is stingy versus the run. This game total has a total of 44 points. New Orleans is a 3-point favorite, but I think San Francisco, to move the ball, they're going to have to do it through the air. As I said, New Orleans is stingy versus the run. Now, Sanders is averaging 5.6 targets per game, only 11.1 fantasy points per game. New Orleans is 22 versus the wide receiver position and giving up 39.1 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. He's had 13 red zone targets, average depth of target 9.7 yards, really low .142 fantasy points per snap, and as I said, 44 is the over-under. At 5,800, it doesn't take much to get value with that. And if you want to get exposure to this game, New Orleans and bring it back with some of the San Francisco, I think that's kind of sneaky. And I think people are staying away from this game because you do have 2 good defenses. And San Francisco, obviously, their defensive numbers are better. But New Orleans at home, they like to get pressure on the quarterback, obviously. And I just have a feeling at this price, if New Orleans is able to score and take San Francisco out of there, comfort zone of running the ball, which is what they obviously want to do. But if New Orleans is able to put some points on the board, you can see a situation where Garoppolo is going to Emmanuel Sanders, and I'll have some exposure to Sanders. Next up is Fuller from Houston. He's 5,500. He's getting 6.9 targets per game, scoring 14 fantasy points per game. Denver giving up 29.8 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, DVP of 5. He's had 5 red zone targets. He has an average depth of target of 14.5 yards. He's averaging .272 fantasy points per snap. This game has a horrible game total of 41.5 points. Fuller, to me, has the best matchup on the whole main slate. He is going to be Chris Harris is going to be matched up against Hopkins. Fuller gets a matchup with Will Parks, who is allowing a 148.5 quarterback rating. So, to me, this is the best matchup. This will probably scare a lot of people off. Denver's defense is very good against the run, very good against the pass, but they have weaknesses beyond Chris Harris. Chris Harris accounts for a lot of their defensive strength back there, and it's going to be tough on Hopkins, but I feel like this game is setting up for Fuller, and Houston's obviously playing for a lot at home. He's affordable, 5,500, definitely a nice pivot off of Hopkins, and a contrarian pick because a lot of people will be staying away due to the defense for Denver. But the matchup for him is really, really good. And like I said, it's the best on this slate. And so I'll be having some exposure to him. Next is Jamison Crowder for the Jets. He's 5,300, getting 7.1 targets per game, only scoring 11.2 fantasy points per game. Miami, number 24 DVP versus the wide receiver position, giving up 40.4 fantasy points per game. He's had 9 red zone targets, 7.8 average depth of target, scoring .231 fantasy points per snap. This game is it's okay at 45. It's not super low. It's just not high either. And Crowder didn't have a great game last week. He still got targeted 9 times. And I think the Jets passing game will go a little bit under-owned. And Fitzpatrick from Miami is going to want to throw the ball all around. And seeing what they did against Philadelphia last week, they're a dangerous team because they can play any old way and take any kind of chances that they like. But Crowder gets a lot of targets and 5,300 exposure to this game, and this game might be real sneaky to stack even at 45. The average total of the top 5 stacked teams last week was, or the top 5 quarterbacks, last week was 45 points. That was the average over under. So 45 isn't out of the question as far as game totals to target passing games. And they are actually a 5-point home favorite, so fairly close game within a touchdown. What they're projecting. So I definitely want to have some exposure to Crowder. Does get a decent volume of targets. Next under Crowder is Robbie Anderson. Had 10 targets last week. He is 5,100. He's averaging 5.7 targets per game, 9.6 fantasy points per game. Same numbers versus Miami, 24 DVP with us. They're giving up 40.4 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. He's had 4 red zone targets. He has a ADOT of 15.1, which is one of the highest on this slate. He's .21 fantasy points per snap. Again, the game total is 45, which is, it's kind of meh. But I like the Jets passing game this week. This game, like I said, could be real sneaky to stack. And there's all kinds of pieces that you can use from both teams, and they're real affordable. So, and they don't have real high ownership, and I'll be covering that in my lineup building video, some of the ownership numbers. But this could be some sneaky receivers to be stacking up with Darnold, and maybe a pivot off of Le'Veon Bell, which will probably be popular as well due to volume. So definitely have interest in both those receivers. And Anderson was the go-to last week in Cincinnati. So it's just a matter of picking which one of these. And Crowder in the slot, Darnold's been going to him a lot. And you can see here in the numbers, even the average targets per game, Crowder's averaging more. But he's only $200 more than Robbie Anderson. And with Fitzpatrick slinging the ball around, you could see it going to this game could potentially shoot out. So I'll definitely have some exposure to some Jets lineups, Jets Miami stacks. Wanted to go back to Tyler Boyd. Now that gave me 13 receivers. I don't want to stop on 13 receivers, so I added another receiver to give me off 13. Little bit superstitious. I went back and I added Tyler Boyd. Boyd is $5,900. They raised his price this week. He's getting 9.3 targets per game. He obviously had a much better game with Andy Dalton being back. He's scoring 14.2 fantasy points per game. Cleveland is number 12 DVP versus the wide receiver position, giving up 33.3 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. He's had 6 red zone targets, has an average depth of targets of 7.3. He's scoring .226 fantasy points per snap. It is a horrible over-under on this game. It's the lowest total on the main slate. But he has a really good matchup against TJ Carey, who's allowing a 118 quarterback rating. So I really like Boyd this week. He's affordable, which allows you to get some other things going in your lineup without punting any position. I don't punt any position. So that gives me 14 total wide receivers that I'm going to be targeting. And these are the ones that I'll be, and I have a target for all my quarterbacks, except I don't have a target for Lamar Jackson, but he's the one quarterback that I'm willing to run out there without one. He's a quarterback and running back combination. So recapping the wide receivers that I'm going to be targeting in week 14 are Michael Thomas, just follow along over here, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams. I'm on the fence with him. That's why he's in yellow. If I do have exposure, it'll be low exposure. Drop down to Chris Godwin, Michael Evans. I like both of these. It's just a matter of picking which one. Under those two is Edelman from New England. I really like the New England, Kansas City getting as many pieces of that game to stack. I like Hill and Edelman. Under Edelman, DJ Moore, I got him in yellow. My exposure to him will be lower because my exposure to McCaffrey is going to be higher, and I just don't see that there's enough there to pay. They've raised his salary up to $7,000, so to pay that off, I just don't feel like there's that much there. If you got McCaffrey, and if McCaffrey is going off, then DJ Moore is not going to be going off. So it's kind of like pick one or the other, unless it's a really high scoring game. But after DJ Moore is Calvin Ridley. I'd like Ridley as a pivot off of Julio Jones. 6,700. He's priced up, but I really like the matchup. Game totals, third highest on the slate at 47 points, and he has a really good matchup in this game. Odell Beckham Jr., just sneaky. He's priced 6,300. He's priced lower than Landry. Has a really good matchup versus BW Webb for Cincinnati. Could be very sneaky at that price. And could pay off value. I mean, he could smash. He hasn't really had that ceiling game this year. He's getting the targets, and I think he's going under the radar. And this could be real. This could be a really smash spot for him. So I'm going to have some exposure to Beckham. Tyler Boyd, as I mentioned, he has a good matchup as well in the same game. T.J. Carey. It's the game total that really scares me and everybody else away. The lowest total on the board at 40.5 points, but at 5,900, it doesn't take a whole lot to get to value. That's Dalton's favorite target, and you could see him getting it done. Emmanuel Sanders for San Francisco, I like that. I think San Francisco is going to have to move the ball through the air. He's 5,800, allows you to work a lot of other things into your lineup, gives you some exposure to that game. Could be sneaky, have more scoring. One of Garoppolo's favorite targets, New Orleans stingy versus the run, could force them to the air. Fuller has the best matchup on the slate, as I mentioned, versus Will Parks from Denver, who's allowing a 148.5 quarterback rating. He's only 5,500. Nice under the radar pick versus Denver's number 5 DVP versus wide receiver position. A lot of people will be off of Will Fuller, and he could be very sneaky in this game at home. Jamison Crowder and 5,300 and Robbie Anderson at 5,100 from the Jets. I really like the Jets passing game. The game totals middle of the road at 45. I'll have some exposure to both of these with any lineups that I may have. Darnold, there's lots of ways to stack this game, and a lot of the players are real affordable. They did raise Parker up to 6,900 this week after the week that he had last week for Miami, and I didn't have him highlighted, but I will have some exposure to Crowder and Anderson. And these were the rest of the wide receivers that I had. I couldn't get them all on this one page. I'll let you take a look at those with the numbers, and I encourage you to screenshot this, pause the video, use this chart how you'd like to build your lineups. I mean, I feel like this is some really helpful information. Excuse me. And as I mentioned earlier in my video, I was able to actually have 4 of the top 5 scoring wide receivers last week in my player pool, and I had the player pool that you could have built the lineup to beat the winner of the Millie Maker on Draftkings last week. But that'll about wrap up the wide receiver video. I'll be coming back tomorrow with the tight end defense special teams video. I don't punt any position, so I cover them all. I'll do that video. Then we'll do some lineup building. I'll show you some lineups that were generated from an optimizer that I use. Put it all together, put it underneath the tree, and do some winning on Sunday. I want to thank you guys for joining me. I encourage you to please post any opinions or comments that you may have below. Please share this video, like it, subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, hit that notification bell so you get notified when my next video posts. My subscribers have been trending upwards, and my viewers have definitely been going up. And a few you guys have reached out and said you thought I should have way more subscribers. I feel the same, and with my viewers going up, I feel like that number will go up. I really want to grow this channel and do some really good things with it. As I mentioned, I'll be back tomorrow to do tight end defense special teams and the lineup building video. You can also follow me on Twitter at winningabout. Don't forget your injury reports, but I'll remind you of that tomorrow as well. The injury reports at 11:30 on Sunday and 2:45 for the afternoon games. Again, thank you for hanging in there with me. I hope this chart helps you out and this information. My name is Ty Patton. This is all about winning daily fantasy sports, and I'll see you tomorrow.